I'm Sam Allen, the Chief Executive of the North East and North Cumbria Integrated Care Board, and welcome to the second episode of Beyond the Now, which is our leadership podcast where we talk to leaders and explore what it means to lead with vision, purpose and impact. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Henry Kippen, who is the Chief Executive of the North East Mayoral Combined Authority. We're going to be talking about leadership across complex systems. Henry, what it takes together. And it's been great working with you over the last couple of years, and really how we kind of deliver on our shared ambitions and think about health, I think, as the cornerstone of inclusive economic growth. So I know that this is an area you've got significant experience in, and you're kind of bringing that here to the North East, which is fantastic. So I think we're here today to have a conversation really as two leaders in the North East, and I think we'll really get into what it means to collaborate, the role of trust in collaboration, and how through working together and building that relationship we can develop a kind of healthier and prosperous future for our communities, which I think particularly when we choose a role in public service leadership, that's kind of absolutely central to our values. So Henry, you've been here a little while now. It's been a really busy couple of years for you, and I just wondered if we could sort of dig a little bit behind the scenes and what it's been like setting up the combined authority, kind of what some of your ambitions are, and tell us what it's been like, Henry.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for the conversation. We've been really looking forward to it, partly because it has been really busy and we've got an hour to have a nice rest and talk about it now, which is not often you get that chance. So we've had a really busy year, and actually 2-3 years before that as a region, coming together to do 2 devolution deals, create a combined authority for a directly elected mayor for the region, start to deliver services to the public through that devolution deal, like transport skills, housing, economic growth, and getting into the question that you posed at the outset about future public services and system leadership and what that means. So yeah, it's been a really busy year, and it kind of should be, because we've taken our time as a region in the North East to get here. It's now time to make it work and do that at pace. So myself, colleagues, wider partners in the region, this is for everybody, isn't it? We're all working really hard, and we should be. We're really pleased to be.
Absolutely. Any particular standout moments from a leadership perspective over the last couple of years for you in this role, Henry?
Lots of standout moments, but for me, the election of the mayor, the first cabinet meeting that we had. So every bit of the public sector is different. I'm sure you'll see that through the interviews that you do on this podcast over time. For us, the set piece for the combined authority is, we call it our cabinet. It's where the mayor and the leaders of all of the councils, which is Durham up to Northumberland, 7 councils in the North East, they all sit together and in effect make decisions, take the decisions that we then affect as officials. And seeing the whole of the North East together on day one, doing that for the first time, sat there in the council chamber, after all of that work to create the combined authority. It's not just me that's put in a shift to that. There's a lot of people who did a lot of hard work to get there. It's a really proud moment. I have to say, a year on, we can look, this mayor, like any other, is doing a 1 year in office. What have I achieved? What's next? And actually, we've done a lot. We've made a really good start. We've hit the ground running. We've got well over $500 million worth of funding out into the system, or allocated, should I say, to projects that are going to make a really big difference. So I'm really proud of that. I think there's lots more to do, but I think we've made a really good start.
It's hard to even kind of imagine it's only been 12 months for the mayor. I remember being in Sunderland at Love Amelia the day the mayor announced her particular focus around child poverty and reducing child poverty in the region. And I've also seen a new metro line, train line open up from Ashington as well into the city. So there's been some pretty kind of major ambitions there, along with the delivery of some things. Just that sort of contrast between the sort of child poverty and then things like the transport links. I wonder if you could just kind of share just kind of how these things are connected and why they're important.
So they are, definitely. Goes back to your opening comments about health and well-being and the social infrastructure in the region and its economic prospect, its economic growth. And in a way, that is what we mean by inclusive growth, isn't it? And a region like this has to do both the big infrastructure, the inward investment, the job creation, attracting foreign direct investment into the region, making sure we've got really big new manufacturing facilities to do high-end cabling for the net zero economy, let's say, that are attracting PhD level jobs. We've also got to recognise that we're top of a lot of league tables that we don't want to be top of, and that's very true in health terms and also in terms of social policy more broadly. I think an agenda for a combined authority needs to balance the two. So ultimately, the determinants of well-being and health in the region are economic, and the determinants of our economic success are to do with health. And it's very, very cyclical, isn't it? We've had a lot of evidence over time that absolutely confirms that, particularly here. If we don't create the jobs, if we don't create the skills pipelines, if we don't help the system to work better so that people can access better housing, they can get to work for a quid. As you know, one of the things I'm proudest of is the £1 for young people at bus fares and keeping the bus fares down. They're such important health interventions, because without that, you lose the ability to affect the wider determinants, and in effect, you're dealing at an acute level with problems down the line, aren't you? And that's the oldest tale in time. So between ourselves, between the work of the health system in all its parts, and then what we can do along with our local authorities and private partners to grow the economy, you should have a really virtuous cycle over time. But in a region like this, it takes time, and we've had a long tail of economic disappointments over time. The labour market's quite fragile. We're really bullish about our positioning now and the renaissance that we're seeing, and we are, in terms of economic confidence. The chief exec of Lloyds Bank told us last week at the UK Reef conference in Leeds that SME confidence in the northeast now outstrips the rest of the country, which is really brilliant to hear. But we need to keep the faith and keep going and keep building, both on the social intervention side and on that kind of heavy infrastructure and economic related intervention side too. And I think, to be fair, it's quite a brave thing to do for a mayor and cabinet to make commitments around child poverty. A lot of the levers to address it are not in the control of the region. You know, they're about national benefits policy, let's say, or the state of the economy, or the extent to which people can live and be in work and not still experience poverty. We know that the in-work poverty stats are horrific, aren't they, if you look across the country. So to say we are going to hold ourselves to account on material reductions in the poverty people experience, child poverty in particular, it's a brave thing. It means we're going to have to operate as a system. It means we're going to have to see this as a long-term play that goes well beyond a single mayoral term. So I think that's quite energising. You either see that as a challenge that can't be met, or you go, okay, let's do it.
I would agree with you, and I think it is particularly brave in political terms, because we know shifting deeply ingrained health inequalities, improving life expectancy, life opportunity isn't something you're going to do in 1 to 5 years. It does require a deep commitment from all working, not just in the public sector, but also working across private sectors as well over many years. And, I think it is a fantastic ambition, and one definitely we're absolutely committed to working jointly with you on. Your standout moment around the cabinet and that kind of sense of when the cabinet first met, you must have just felt such a kind of sense of achievement, really, because quite often people don't see the work and effort that goes into collaborations and partnerships behind the scenes, the many conversations. And I think in health terms, we've got some similar examples. We've just had the Great North Healthcare Alliance announced, and that's definitely been something we've been working on with our NHS organisations locally here for the last 18 months. Could you just sort of say a bit about your experience in terms of how you kind of create these successful collaborations, and that, I think, as leaders, balancing the ambition and the desire with sharing power and authority, and maybe the kind of way you see is the good examples of that, and some of the kind of the more difficult days when you're doing the hard yards, but actually you're not making the progress you need. What does that feel like? What are some of the strategies that you've used, Henry?
I think the first thing to say is that you're never doing it on your own. You know, that's really true, and we've all read enough NAF leadership texts about sort of hero style leadership and what that takes. CEOs that get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, do 70 press ups, eat muesli, and then go to work and change the world and go back and then a perfect fathers and all the rest of it. I mean, you never do anything on your own that sticks. And outcomes generally, I mean, we know we work in public services, different types of public service, but outcomes are things that are co-produced, aren't they? Services are things that are delivered and experienced. It's a relationship, and I think that's really true of any big change. System change is big as devolution, which involves politics, it involves business, it involves lots of different parts of the public sector and the voluntary sector too. You have to build a sense of shared mission, shared intent, whether that is a problem that everyone feels they're there to crack, or indeed in this case, it's about our sector catching up with the reality of how people already live, because actually there's quite a strong sense of identity within the North East, isn't there? There's quite a strong depth of collaboration across the institutions within the region. You have to have a degree of humility that says, well, you've got a role to play here, but to some extent you're catching up with the reality of others. I think there's loads of great pithy phrases about collaboration. I as you know, I used to run an organisation called Collaborate with Lord Adebowale, who we both know well, who can give chapter and verse on the leadership text on collaboration, but the best quote I ever heard was that it was the putting down of mutual enmities in the pursuit of cash, which I think sometimes in the environment that we're in feels like that is all it is, but actually it needs to be more than that. It needs to be about something more profound, and for devolution deals to succeed, in fact for mayors to succeed, for all of us, you need a really clear evidence base. You need a really clear narrative about where you're going. So we are either a tier of administration and a load of deck chair shuffling, or we're a mission-driven organisation that's there to change something, and it has to be the latter. And that is the thing that has to be constantly reinforced through the lifetime of doing a deal. But also then, when you're out in the wild, every time we sit together every month with the political team and with the wider world, you show what's the point? Why are you there? Why would you miss us if we were gone? And that bit of it is often lost within public service reform conversations, because we're always so driven by the financial context or the governance implications. But actually, it's about the strength of the narrative on where's this region going, and then your ability to say, okay, we'll back that with real investment, we'll back that with real powers, and maybe central government can meet us halfway rather than defining for us what that looks like. So there's a lot in there, but it's never about heroic individuals. It's always about the sense of mission and purpose, and almost creating a kind of ratchet effect, so that every day you're pushing further towards that set of outcomes. That's my belief anyway, I think.
That's really, really interesting to hear. So I kind of want to go back to you a little bit now. So, looking at your career, and you're now in this major regional role, but your leadership journey has been shaped by kind of some pretty unique experiences. And you've already just mentioned your kind of leadership at Collaborate, working closely with Victor, who is fantastic. I remember first meeting Victor, about 15 years ago, was a junior manager in the NHS, and one of the things that always struck me about Victor was his ability to focus on people and building relationships, and that kind of being the bedrock of leadership. You've also done international work, cross-party collaboration, and you are a PhD doctor, and real focus around complexity and systems thinking. So how have all of those experiences kind of shaped the way you're leading today in this role?
So I've done a few podcasts, interviews about leadership, and it's hard to know what to pass on and what ends up making you sound like a slightly souped up version of David Brent describing your life story. But you do, it is absolutely true that you learn, or I have learned something from all of those experiences. The time I spent in sub-Saharan Africa working in the development industry and the kind of European work, it was a real lesson to me in understanding the value, should I say, of doing things in a bottom-up way, by which I mean, if you think about the development industry, the assumptions that we as a country and or the World Bank and the Washington-based institutions had about what would support economies in parts of the world like Tanzania, when that plays out on the ground in very different ways. So I think that gave me quite a healthy understanding of why you need that bottom-up spirit in any collaboration, why the kind of future of the region needs to be defined by the region itself, if you like. And then moving into working in UK politics and policy, I was lucky really to work with some great people, including Victor, but also others who'd had a really strong background in health policy, Matthew Taylor, Stephen Dorrell, people like Bridget Rosewell, Hilary Cottam, people who've had really different perspectives to bring that have all been quite radical in their own way. Some really very micro, how does relational thinking influence the way you deliver public services? Some very macro in terms of, how can different approaches to working with the private sector unlock investment at scale in a place? And I guess the thing is just taking something from all of that, isn't it? Trying to apply it. And you, in a role like this, there is a value in being pragmatic, and I don't mean that in a boring sense, because pragmatism can sometimes be construed as, just plodding along. But you have to have a respect for democracy. I'm not the mayor and never will be and don't want to be. I'm not a council leader. Their mandate to act and to lead is really clear. Within that, though, there's a lot of operating space for someone in my role or, chief exec of a local authority, let's say, to interpret that, to find really creative ways of delivering on that, and to start to build something that goes beyond yourself, which is the key thing, really, isn't it? I'm sure we'll talk about that, but you cannot build an organisation that falls over if you leave the room, and that's I think in every sector that's true. That's all the more true in a sector that isn't about me or you. It's about the outcomes for public and communities at the end of the process. That's really fundamental, I think.
I think it's a really important point, I think, as a leader, because I think sometimes we'll observe leadership which is about the ego or self, and actually that sort of real strong sense of connectedness that you're describing to the mission, to the purpose, and thinking kind of beyond today, and actually how do you establish something that is going to, it ultimately is not going to rely on your leadership, but actually it'll be strong enough to kind of go on and thrive in the absence of the leader who might be seen at the helm in the role of the chief executive. Is just so crucial. I've been really impressed actually seeing you build your team here at the Combined Authority, and I think people maybe listening to this might be interested to hear kind of, what was going through your mind in establishing the team that you've established, and how did you go about that, Henry?
Yeah, a really interesting process and quite organic in a way. So the devolution deal in this region, they're different everywhere. Every combined authority is built on something, whether it's a transport agency or a fire authority, or in our case, we brought together 5 organisations into one, which was a LEP, an economically focused institution, a combined authority for the north of Tyne. We brought together a transport team. We brought together an inward investment arm as well, and then organisations within the orbit of those. So the first stage of that was trying to find a way of bringing together organisations under the sense of mission, as it described, making sure there was a degree of comfort through transition, because actually at the point at which the region's going through a really big and quite emotional political transition, the last thing you want to do is pull the tablecloth up and say, well, everything else is in the air now and we're starting from scratch. So creating a new organisation with a new identity, but from the bones of, and the great work that had gone on for years actually, and the skill sets of people to build that, it is quite a delicate balance. Requires quite a lot of respect for what's gone before, but also a sense of, okay, we've got a new itch to scratch now. Intrinsic to that, I think, is being really careful about how you recruit a leadership team. So pretty deliberately, and with cross-party political support, I must say, which is really vitally important in these things. We went through that process and then decided to recruit a leadership team as one, if you like. So everyone arrived at a slightly different time, but it was all within a 2 or 3 month time frame. Now we have 5 executive directors for a combined authority, which makes it fit for purpose, really, for the size and scale. We've got a 3 billion devolution deal that we're delivering, so it needs good people to get behind the ball alongside colleagues around the rest of the region. But recruiting as one, or for the most part anyway, as one, gave me the ability to look at the balance between people, which you don't get when you're doing that incrementally necessarily. It gave me the ability to do almost a pre and post. So I knew how it felt without those directors around me to be brilliant and do what they're doing. It also, and I can feel the contrast now, which is really less about then doing the work and running the show, and more about saying, well, where's my value add as a leader now? You know, there'll be plenty of areas where it's still there, but there'll also be areas which are new. So what are the big economic plays in the region that I can now focus attention on that need that senior focus, let's say. So it opens up new possibilities, isn't it? And every organisation goes through that kind of excitement, almost like the tulip opening, and it's so wonderful, and then you go through the opposite, and then you have the retrenchment, and then and we'll be the same. You know, the combined authorities are so young as institutions, really. Even Greater Manchester's only about 10 years old, isn't it? So we don't really understand what steady state looks like yet. Yeah. So we don't know what the steady state leadership job is, and in a way I don't want to, because constant evolution is where we need to be, given that from a political point of view what you want is more funding and powers in the region, because that will benefit people. Therefore the organisation has to keep evolving. So it's been a good process. Again, to nick another Victorism, that my favourite leadership quote is that it's about what happens when you're not in the room, and that being able to start to see that culture forming, playing a part in establishing it, which is a real privilege in the public sector, as you know, because you've done it with the ICB. You very rarely get to set up an organisation within the public sector. It's quite an unusual thing to do, and having the privilege of doing that more than once is, I don't underestimate that. It's a really quite unique set of experiences, but you don't own it. You get to set it out the traps. You get to provide a value set, if you like. You get to try and embody what you believe in, and then it's everyone's, isn't it? So actually watching that and being part of that happening is really, I find that really rewarding.
Yeah, no, that's great. It is a real privilege to get that opportunity. Although I would say the 3 years that the ICB has been around, I'd rather not have the privilege probably of reorganising it again in the near future, Henry. I mean, just thinking about that, I mean, we're going through a lot of change in the NHS, as you know, and it's actually quite exciting in many ways. And I think we're all waiting with eager anticipation for the new 10-year plan for health and what that's going to bring. And I suppose in the sort of world of combined authorities, there's more combined authorities on the horizon. What's your advice to other combined authorities, but also NHS leaders who will be figuring out what's the role of the combined authority? How do I interface with them? How do we work together? What would your best advice be to colleagues?
Oh, well, in terms of advice and support, that part of your question, if I think about combined authorities as part of the wider local government family, which we're kind of curious fish in that we're local, we're regional, but we also have a national role too, and of course our mayors are directly elected, but we are constructed from local authorities that have been through 10 years plus of having to reorganise on the basis of a really shifting financial picture, but also with patterns of demand that have changed over time, as you know well. You know, we're more complex as human beings, aren't we? Our expectations of the services we receive have changed, lives have changed in terms of life work patterns. There's a lot of experience in any region in how you manage for that, how you adapt to that. I would like to think that in organisational change terms we can do better together than we can do watching each other go through these processes in silos. I think the past history of the health service has been, albeit it's a system, not a service, and I think I understand some of the complexity of that anyway, but has too often operated within its own walls, if you like, and you could probably say the same for other public services too. The point of devolution over time, I think, should be to provide a bit of insulation at a regional level for people to do things a bit differently, to say, actually, in this region, we want to take a different approach, whether that is a shared approach to commissioning particular out-of-hospital services, or whether that is thinking about how we do population health analysis differently, or, you know, in our good case example that we're working on together at the moment in the work and health space, where we can think about that mix of DWP, health and local government related activity, and how we can start to shape that together for once. Because actually, if you're not using devolution to do that, what is it? It's just the transfer of resources from one place to another. You never really get that kind of system and service change that you need without getting into that space. So I actually think part of the answer to your question is leaning into devolution, making it work. Ask the question. I am convinced that will look different in different areas. I don't think the health deal, devolution deal that Greater Manchester did X years ago is appropriate for this region necessarily, but there might be other areas in which we really can streak ahead, and work and health is a really interesting and good one. On areas like child poverty, we'll start to intertwine, I'm sure, a lot more. So I think devolution can be air cover, if you like, for a lot more reform type thinking. And as we all go into this period where there's organisational change happening, you talked about it in restructure terms, whether we use that word or not, we're all going to have to change pretty profoundly over the next few years, because the sort of patterns of demand that we're facing, or that we're servicing, if you like, they are constantly changing, aren't they? The environment changes, whether that's thinking about how the population's different, or climate change requirements, or the economic situation, and the supply side is going to be different too, isn't it? I mean, we look at the impact of AI on diagnostics. That's just as one example. It's huge, isn't it? So within 5-10 years, we'll be totally different as organisations again, I think.
Yeah, and I think that sort of opportunity around the public sector reform and making sure that every pound, as much as every pound spent in the public sector, is delivering impacts and outcomes for our population. And, we have to challenge our thinking around our infrastructure, where we can share resources, share expertise. And there's got to be more efficient and effective ways of doing that. I was just sort of thinking back to also the region here, and I think it's got such a long history of being pioneers and wanting that sense of self-determination and control, and doing the best we can for the people here. We've got a huge opportunity, but I would agree with you that we've got to lean into devolution and kind of think about actually how do we do this better together. The Health and Growth Accelerator you mentioned is a really exciting development, I think, particularly given the impact on health and prosperity and economic growth. Just sort of thinking, Henry, where do you think that could go in the future? We're doing some great work together, our teams, supporting people, either whether it's into employment, being able to maintain their employment, the skills development and that link on health. But where do you think this could go in the next sort of 10 to 20 years?
So, good question. I think that's one of the most exciting areas that we're involved in a devolved context at the moment, not least because it's taken a while to get there, isn't it? You can understand, I think, really clearly the rationale for devolved funding to support more housing, let's say, devolution of transport, levers, certain bits of the skills system, but it's always been really difficult to create any space really anywhere near the benefit system, or let's say the kind of referrals that go on between the NHS and Job Centre Plus and local authorities. So to be in that space, doing some constructive work that is basically trying to prove the concept that doing this in a joined up, devolved way is better than national level policy making handed to the region through prime and subcontracting that happens miles away and is at scale and in a way that doesn't really connect with the public. We have to prove that concept. We have to prove that that is right. We've been saying people like me have been saying for years, it's probably not okay that a big prime contractor comes into the region and cherry picks the easiest clients and leaves us with the worst problems again. Mm-hmm. So we have to prove the concept that can be done differently, and in particular, unlocking IPS style referral in and out of the health system, making sure you've got DWP, NHS, DFE, ourselves working hand in glove. Totally important. So actually just delivering that well is really key for that reason, I think. In terms of what happens next, I think we need that to unlock further developments in localised welfare. Mm-hmm. I think we need that to unlock further developments in skills system, if you like. So if the mayor was sat here, she would say, as I'm sure other mayors would, the next stage of devolution on skills needs to be to take adult education devolution, which every combined authority is busy effecting at the moment, and we're doing well, and starting to think about that 16, 19 big block, really, with kids leaving school and going to college. Really, there's very little influence that the region can have on what they do. Thinking about how you join that up with performance in schools and well-being around school-age kids, because mental health at that age is such a key thing, and we know how that translates into dysfunction within mental health commissioning and services too. So there's a whole lot of join-up that you can do that I think is really possible, but it needs to come with a sense of possibility that actually comes from evidence-based and a bit of proof of concept. So it's really, really important work for us, and I'm really pleased that we're doing that together. It's great that we've managed to unlock resources on the NHS and the MCA devolution side of this. I think it's important that we do that together.
Absolutely, and I think even just seeing some of the early case studies and how people are describing the support that they're getting and the impact it's had on their lives as life-changing, I think shows the real value in purpose and what we're doing and sort of really changing lives. Just kind of switching up a little bit, I was really interested to see the launch of Great North, and it was great to see our mayor heading that up across the whole of the north of England. And I just wonder if you could firstly just say a bit about what the Great North is, and then perhaps maybe what this alliance across the north could unlock potentially for people living in the north.
Happy to. So let me have a go at explaining what the Great North is. And of course, the people in the northeast will be used to the language. The Great North Run is a huge part of our identity as a region, and to some extent the concept comes from Sir Brendan and the team at the Great Run Company. There's been a real collaboration between Brendan and the mayors in order to unlock this. But in essence, the Great North is about providing a collaborative structure and a brand and an identity to start to convene across the north at scale to do the following things. So one is to make sure we are punching our weight in terms of trade, economic growth, export, in a way we're using the Great North to start to facilitate the North working at scale in areas where it has to. So if you take, for example, one example, let's say a trade mission on clean energy over in Texas, well, or in the States. Well, actually, is it really right that North Yorkshire or Tees Valley is doing that? Or is it right that we have the scale of the North because we can offer everything from offshore wind to small nuclear to tidal in Liverpool? You start to be able to create an economic construct that is at scale and that can compete internationally. So that's part of the rationale. Second part of this is about supporting collaboration. So we know, the history of all of this suggests that some things can be done at a regional level and should be, and we'll press on with that. But there's really limited value in competition between us. We should be competing with Boston and Barcelona and Beijing and not Leeds and Greater Manchester. That's just inane, isn't it, if you get into that space? So the competition for limited public resource, I think, has defined us to too great an extent. So creating something like the Great North allows us to say, okay, how could we work together? If we've all got skills propositions that are similar, how can we share resource? If we're all going to move to franchising, to bus reform in effect, which is a really profound change, and we all have to go through the same legal processes, we all have to procure new buses, we all have to do things to get there that are very similar. Why can't we think about a construct that can enable us to do that together? So I think it'll be really important for that as well. And from the northeast point of view, I don't want this to come across as parochial, but it's really important that the north is the whole north. I mean, for quite a long time, the narrative around devolution has been well led by colleagues in Greater Manchester initially, and it's kind of spread out from there as an M62 play, if you like. It's really important for the northeast that we're included in that, and that's not just my part of the patch, that's for our colleagues in Tees. You look down now, we have a new mayor in Hull and East Riding. We've got mayoral arrangements across the whole north, either in place or emerging in the next year or so now. And again, that's part of the rationale. You start to get political coverage at that level. There's real power and influence in that I think that Great North can help us to unlock.
I think it's hugely important because you don't want any one part of the north to be left behind. And I think that collaboration, I think there's some real lessons for us in the NHS, Henry, because I think sometimes in the NHS, although we talk about the NHS as if it's one organisation, actually it's made up of many organisations, and that type of alliance and collaboration at that scale, I think, could bring us real opportunities. So we'll be watching that with interest. And I'm sure the North East, I think, is the leading area for offshore wind power, will be really bringing that, I suspect, to that alliance, which is fantastic.
I mean, on that point, Sam, you're right about offshore wind. We have the largest offshore wind farm in Dogger Bank off our coast. We've got everything really from the kind of engineering and the supply chain to the R&D and the testing and the cabling in this region too. So it's really important. And as we head into this next period of government, where you've got these twin objectives really of growing the economy, providing jobs and skills, making sure that you've got increased prosperity after a period in which people have really felt, well, it's just stands to reason, doesn't it? We're by lots of measures poorer than we were 5 or 6 years ago, even at the moment. So we have to be in the business of economic growth, whether you like that term or not. It's absolutely vital. And also that transition that we're making, again, you can love the net zero language or hate it, and there's versions of that politically that are pushing either at the moment. But sustainable energy, being able to power our economic ambitions in future, is going to be vital, whatever your political view. At the moment, so I think the North East is really well placed, because actually a lot of if you think of this as a mutually reinforcing yin and yang or cycle or something like that, you can see the progress towards that transition, that energy transition and job creation are mutually reinforcing, aren't they? Yeah. We will create lots more jobs here in those sectors, and therefore driving progress in those sectors, which is not just a benefit to us, but of the whole North and the whole country. And that's a position we haven't been in for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I think also it's such a good example of what we've been talking about all the way through, about that link between economic growth, prosperity, and the health and well-being of the local population. Having good jobs, good jobs that our population who are graduating some of the leading universities in the country locally can find good career opportunities locally and aren't having to move away for that. And then thinking about, actually, if you've got employment, if you've got purpose and meaning, the impact that has on your well-being and your health. And indeed, part of all of this is about having excellent local health services as well. And our 2 tertiary centres in the north, particularly here at Newcastle. We're sat here in Newcastle, but also down in the Tees Valley, and making sure that they're also supporting, connecting parts of our region over in Cumbria is hugely important as well. So
the importance of great public services to our economy is often underplayed within economic strategies. If you look at the standard version of a growth plan, it will often not include social care, public services, the foundational economy. We know that's what makes the region tick, not just in terms of a region that's traditionally been quite dependent on big employers, but now increasingly SMEs provide the most jobs, and within that, a substantial amount of those people are working in what you might call the foundational economy. But if you look at public services, well over 30% of GDP in this region's spent on public services, huge employer, health service in particular. We'd be daft not to think about that as part of our economic strategy. And in fact, it's part of the attraction of the region, isn't it? Whether you're a young doctor wanting to work in a specialist centre that is world leading, or you just want to be in a place where you're going to be looked after if things go wrong. It's a really important part of the region's economic story.
Yeah, massive. And we probably haven't got time to go into it at all, but one of the programmes of work that we're doing jointly with our local authority partners, I'm particularly excited about, is the Housing, Health and Care programme. And again, that link between, good housing and people's health and well-being and life expectancy as well. So maybe that's a subject of a future podcast. So I just want to finish just a couple of things, kind of getting back down to you. So you've had, a really full-on couple of years setting this up, and you're adjusting now, you've got your team in place. So I know, because you talk about it a little bit. You're a bit partial to going watching the football in Gateshead, Henry, and doing some other things. You've got a young family as well. But how do you kind of relax as a leader? How do you switch off and your own kind of resilience and well-being? Say a bit about that.
Yeah, probably the hardest question of all of them to answer, isn't it? If we're honest. So, I love spending time with my kids. That switches anybody off. Well, actually, it switches you off to one thing and onto another, doesn't it? So everything from, my oldest boy loves fishing. I love sitting on the bank of the lake or the river and concentrating on pulling out a big carp and not doing a devolution deal. That's a good way of switching off. Similarly, coaching a under-10s football team for my youngest. That's like joyous stuff, isn't it? It's real life stuff, and that absolutely helps me. I think I need balance. Everyone needs balance. I think it's okay that the balance shifts sometimes. So I think, and I'm saying this honestly, but through those periods where devolution and the work, if you like, in the region has been intense, I've felt that work is not, me dredging myself out of bed and coming into the office. I've wanted it. I feel a really strong sense of connection to what the region's doing and my role within it. And I've happily done that, as have lots of other leaders around me. So I think getting the balance right, really important. And that balance sometimes changes. For me, it's kids, it's sport, it's music. I play the guitar, piano. I play the piano really badly as well. So like making music, that type of thing. Not complicated in that sense, but you've got to have something, haven't you? You have to have something.
Favourite book on leadership?
Actually, my favourite book on leadership is a book by this is so niche, honestly, it's awfully niche, but by an academic called James Ferguson, who wrote a book about development policy in Lesotho in South Africa during the 90s, and he writes about kind of local leadership of development projects, and it was hugely inspiring to me because at the time I was working in sub-Saharan Africa and thinking about how you translate these big World Bank programs into something that local people would recognise and want to be part of. And that was hugely inspiring to me. So I can't give you a kind of airport text, but a real in the weeds study, which I suppose is the academic bit in me. I love that kind of thing still. But probably people have inspired me more than books in terms of leadership. I've had good bosses. I've been quite lucky. I've had worked with really great people, male and female leaders of all ages. I think that's the most important bit.
Yeah. And just finally then, Henry, what does success for the region look like in 10 years?
So 2 answers. I think one is a formal answer that has lots of numbers in it. So there are a whole host of things that we need to change in the region. We've pledged to, we need to. So 25,000 more jobs, for example. I want to not be top of the table on levels of child poverty in the UK. It is absolutely vital that we change that. In terms of the skill levels of our population and the extent to which you've got people growing up here, staying here and getting good jobs here, that has to change. The emotional side of that, I think, is the same. So if my kids are 10 and 12, I would love them to get to the age of, where they're deciding what they want to do with their life. That's not just playing Minecraft and kicking a football on, and decide that this is a great place to do it. That's not to say that they won't go away, because I did and I've loved it, and that was a great decision, but the possibility is there. This region you can do things in, and in terms of legacy for all of this, I bet there's not many people in this building or even in the wider world we're working in would disagree with that. Now we have to get on with it.
Yeah. It took me 43 years to return back to the region, Henry, from being here as a little girl, and I have to say it's the best decision I ever made. It's a fantastic place to work, people kind of united with a real sense of purpose, and it's been great working with you and look forward to continue working with you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Me too, thank you.